Over the last several lectures, we've been looking at how traits are transmitted from one generation of organisms to the next. We've seen how the movement of chromosomes during mitosis and meiosis are responsible for the continuity of genetic information across generations by assuring that when cells divide, their daughter cells obtain a complete set of genes. 2 copies of each gene obtained on homologous chromosomes in the case of mitosis, 1 copy of each gene during meiosis when haploid gametes are formed. We've also seen how Mendel modeled the genetic basis of trait transmission from parents to offspring based on his experiments with pea plants, showing how traits can assort independently from one another, yielding novel recombinant phenotypes in subsequent generations. A theme of this discussion has been to emphasize how genetic variation arises in populations. Remember that some of this variation is caused by mutations, and even more genetic variation arises when organisms reproduce sexually as the result of genetic recombination. Now, an important consequence of the fact that genetic variation is introduced with each successive generation as organisms reproduce is that this variation provides the substrate for evolutionary change in populations. That is, the biological information, using the term we started this section of the course with, is transmitted from one generation to the next, but does not necessarily stay constant. And a manifestation of this fact has been the transformation and diversification of life on Earth over evolutionary time. Now, I introduced the idea of evolution by natural selection at the very beginning of this course, when we asked how life might have arisen on the early Earth. Over the next several lectures, what we're going to do is to look in more detail at biological evolution and the mechanisms by which it's thought to occur, beginning today with the work of Charles Darwin, the person who developed the theory of natural selection and in so doing profoundly transformed our scientific view of biology, if not our view of the world at large, and probably more so than any other individual who's ever lived. Darwin lived and worked in the middle of the 19th century at about the same time as Gregor Mendel. It's interesting that even though Darwin and Mendel were contemporaries, the two men never met, and there's no evidence that they even knew about each other or about each other's work. Nowadays, biologists take for granted the fact that evolution occurs, but that wasn't really the case 150 years ago when Darwin first introduced his ideas. So as we did with Mendel, let's begin by looking at Darwin's life in order to understand his ideas and where they came from. Darwin was born in 1809 in Shrewsbury, England, in a socially well-connected family. As a boy, the young Charles Darwin developed a keen passion for nature. He was the kind of kid who loved to walk in the woods, collect bugs, go hunting and fishing, bird watching, and generally spend time learning about different kinds of plants and animals. Now, Darwin's father was a well-known physician who really wanted his son to follow him in the medical profession. So in the 1820s, when Darwin was only 16 years old, he was packed off to medical school at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. Darwin at the time had no interest in medicine, however. In fact, it's said that he found it distasteful and even a little upsetting. So he wasn't a successful student, and he soon left the university without a degree. But it wouldn't do for a young man of Darwin's social status in 19th century England to not study for some career. So Darwin enrolled instead in Christ College at Cambridge University to study theology with the goal of entering the clergy. Darwin wanted to be a country vicar. Now, the fact that Darwin went on to complete a bachelor's degree in theology with the idea of becoming a vicar may sound a little surprising to us, but it isn't really. The study of natural history in the 1800s, especially in the first part of that century, was largely done in the context of what we call natural theology, describing nature in order to more fully appreciate the glory of God. Thus, some of the most important natural historians of the time were clergymen. And don't forget that Mendel himself was a monk. And so it seemed to Darwin to be a good way to pursue his true passions. Unlike his experiences with medicine in Edinburgh, Darwin excelled in his studies at Cambridge and became a protege of many of the most eminent professors there. It was this connection that led Darwin to be offered a unique opportunity when he graduated in 1831. Instead of going on to become a country vicar, Darwin was asked to serve as the official naturalist on a 5-year-long voyage around the world on the British Navy's ship HMS Beagle. Darwin's job was twofold. First, he was to provide interesting intellectual conversation to the ship's captain for 5 years. And second, and more importantly, he was to acquire and catalog plant and animal specimens from every place the ship visited on its circumnavigation of the globe. This was something the British Navy was doing a lot in the middle part of the 1800s. Now, when Darwin started his voyage around the world, a long-held view in science, and one that Darwin himself almost certainly subscribed to, was that all organisms were formed by a special creation, much as is described in the book of Genesis in the Bible. And, importantly, that species had remained immutable, unchanged throughout all time. Now, this view of the world isn't just a Christian idea. Some Greek philosophers talked about evolution in their writings, but in fact, Plato and his most famous student Aristotle argued that species must be immutable. In particular, Plato's ideas about the existence of an ideal external world, of which our material world is only a reflection, was simply not compatible with the idea that things in the material world could ever change. Thus, the idea that species living today were completely unchanged throughout time had been a dominant view in Western culture for several thousand years. However, early in the 1800s, there were a few scientific findings beginning to emerge that began to suggest this view was not entirely correct. In fact, there were 3 general kinds of evidence that were particularly challenging to the idea of an immutable creation. The first sort of evidence came from the field of geology. Creationist views of the world argued that the Earth was relatively young, as suggested by a literal interpretation of the Old Testament. For example, in one famous estimate, Archbishop James Ussher of the Irish Protestant Church argued that the Earth was created in 4004 BC at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning. But geologists who were studying landforms and rock formations saw evidence that convinced them that the Earth had to be a lot older than this. First, their analyses showed that the Earth might be unfathomably older, maybe millions of years older, much older than anybody had conceived of at the time. Second, geologists saw that landscape features had obviously undergone many radical transformations. One only has to drive along an interstate highway and look at road cuts to see the bending and the folding in the rocks, which is exactly the kind of thing that these geologists were seeing. Third, geologists began to realize, and this is an important point, that physical forces at work in nature today could explain the transformations in landforms that must have occurred in the distant past. For example, they saw how erosion from rivers and rainfall, if given enough time, could lead to landscape-level transformations such as the creation of a canyon. These ideas were developed completely by the leading geologist of Darwin's day, Charles Lyell, who in the 1820s formally developed the idea of geological gradualism. The theory of gradualism argued that large-scale changes in the geological features of the Earth could be explained by the gradual accumulation of many small changes over a very long period of time. And this was eventually very important to Darwin's thinking. Now, the word evolution simply means change. And what geology had done was show that the physical world, at least, could have changed over a long period of time. Now, the second kind of evidence that began challenging the immutability of biological species in particular came from the work of comparative anatomists. At the time, biology was largely a descriptive enterprise involving the collection, the dissection, and the detailed description of different kinds of plants and animals. In the process of doing this kind of description, anatomists noticed that very different-looking animals obviously shared some of the same basic parts. For example, if you look at the forelimbs of different kinds of mammals, by forelimb I mean the limb that would be the same as our arms, it's easy to see that each animal has a forelimb with a quite different shape, reflecting the fact that the forelimb has a different function, but that they nonetheless share components. So, for example, the human forelimb is suited for reaching and grasping. The cat forelimb is suited for walking. A whale's forelimb is suited for swimming. And a bat's forelimb for flying. But in spite of these differences in shape and function, if you dissect these forelimbs, you can see that they include similar arrangements of bones, tendons, muscles, and so forth. These structures are modified in each species, but they share sufficient similarities to appear as though they had been modified from some original common form. We refer to anatomical features having these kinds of similarities as homologous structures. Now, these kinds of homologous structures could be best explained, it was argued, if living forms were not static, but instead had been transformed from some common form that was shared as an earlier ancestor. An even more problematic case was the appearance of structures that had no apparent function at all, so-called vestigial organs or vestigial structures. An example of this might be the tiny hind limb and pelvic bones that are still found in whales, even though those animals have no hind limbs at all. If species were the result of a single perfect creation event, then why should such structures exist at all? A simpler explanation would be that species had changed over time in such a way that previously useful structures had lost their usefulness. Now, the third sort of evidence that species were not immutable came from the branch of science we call paleontology today. Paleontologists are people who study fossils, which of course are the remains of dead organisms from the past, usually preserved in sedimentary rocks. In the early 1800s, paleontologists began to describe fossils of species that were no longer living on the present-day Earth. Now, the existence of these fossils made it obvious that species weren't constant. At least it demonstrated that some species had existed in an earlier time that no longer existed today. Actually, the science who really is credited with founding the field of paleontology, the French anatomist Georges Cuvier, himself was a staunch opponent of the idea that evolution occurred. Cuvier acknowledged that you could find fossils in the fossil record of species that no longer existed, and furthermore, that fossils of species that hadn't existed earlier would appear at a later time in the fossil record. But he explained this by suggesting that there must be periodic catastrophes that would wipe out species in an area, and then sometimes new species would move in from other areas, making it seem like new species were being created or that species were being lost, but in fact arguing that over the globe as a whole, species were constant. But there was another observation from the field of paleontology that was harder to explain away. It was obvious that some fossil species were similar enough in their anatomy to be related to living species, while at the same time different enough to clearly have to be classified as a different species. In fact, it was possible to find series of fossil species occurring at different times in the fossil record, which seemed to be connected from one ancient form that looked one way to a modern form that existed today with a number of intermediates in between. This was so common that it was given a name. It was called the law of succession. And it was consistent with the idea that species had transformed from one form earlier to a more recent form through evolution. Okay, these kinds of observations coming from geology, comparative anatomy, and paleontology were much discussed in the early part of the 19th century. And some scientists were beginning to suspect, and in fact even suggest in writing, that species were not immutable. That is, the idea that evolution might occur was beginning to be accepted. But what was not at all clear was how evolution could occur. In other words, what would be a mechanism that could account for an evolutionary transformation of species? Darwin's main contribution, as it turns out, was not to actually suggest that evolution occurs. This was already something out there, although Darwin did amass an impressive collection of evidence to show that evolution occurred in his writing. Instead, Darwin's real contribution was to understand the mechanism by which evolution could occur, which was embodied in his theory of natural selection. Now, several explicit theories for how evolution could occur were suggested before Darwin's time. The most notable of these was a theory proposed by a French biologist named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who published this idea fairly early in 1809. Lamarck argued that the lasting changes that occurred to parts of an individual's body that were brought on by excessive use of those parts, or specially intensive use of those parts, could actually be made permanent and transferred to that individual's offspring. Lamarck referred to this theory as the theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics. The idea was that an adult would acquire a characteristic and then the offspring would inherit that acquired characteristic from its parent. Now, the fact that use and disuse of an organ or a structure can have a long-lasting effect on shape and size is obviously true. Lamarck, for example, would compare the forearms of a blacksmith to those of ordinary people to make this point. The biceps of the blacksmith became huge over its lifetime because he was pounding metal all the time. In nature, Lamarck suggested that the extensive use of some body part or organ could similarly cause that body part to become modified to better suit its function. Over evolutionary time, Lamarck argued, such changes would accumulate, causing a species to evolve to better fit its environment. Lamarck's best-known example concerned the neck of the giraffe. Giraffes tend to browse on leaves that are high up in trees, and Lamarck argued that giraffes would continually be stretching their necks up, trying to reach even higher leaves. And as they stretched up, they would gradually, subtly, but gradually lengthen their neck. Now, over time, as each individual's neck was lengthened just slightly, they would transmit that slightly increased length to their offspring, and you would gradually get a longer and longer neck over a long period of time. Now, our modern understanding of genetics, and specifically our understanding of the molecular mechanisms of DNA transcription and translation, which we discussed earlier in the course, makes it clear that Lamarck's theory can't work. Because we know that on a molecular level, information can't go from proteins back to DNA. Now, at Lamarck's time, nobody knew anything about these sorts of specifics, and so his theory seemed as plausible as any. Although, in fact, if you look at this closely, you can obviously tell that there's a problem here because the children of blacksmith don't necessarily have big arms. So Lamarck's theory was not widely accepted. Lamarck did get two ideas that are very important correct. First, of course, he was correct to argue that evolution occurs, and he was one of the first scientists to make that argument strongly. Second, and more importantly, he was correct to point out that the environment plays an important role in evolution. Remember, by Lamarck's view, it was the environment that was driving organisms to change. The giraffe was stretching its neck in response to the environment in the sense that it wanted to get leaves higher up in the tree. And as we'll see, the environment is an important part of how evolution works. Now, it was Darwin's opportunity to serve as the naturalist on the HMS Beagle in its voyage around the world that provided him with his first insights into how evolution might work. In fact, it was this voyage that changed his worldview and convinced him that evolution even occurred in the first place. On this voyage, Darwin began to observe for himself and to document the kinds of evidence for evolutionary change that we discussed earlier, concerning geological change, homologies among species, relationships between fossil forms and living forms, and so on. Particularly illuminating to Darwin were groups of animals and plants occurring on islands that were explored by the Beagle. He would find that if you went to a group of islands, you would often find on different islands species that were similar enough to obviously be related to each other, and yet different enough to be considered species. And furthermore, these species occurring on islands would often resemble a species that was yet different again occurring on the mainland. Now, probably the most celebrated example of this is a closely related group of bird species, now collectively known as Darwin's finches, that occur on the Galapagos Islands in the Pacific Ocean, about 700 kilometers off the coast of Peru. The different islands of the Galapagos differ considerably in their size and in their habitat. And each island habitat has a different species that appears to be uniquely suited for that habitat. In particular, these species differ largely in the size and shape of their beaks, and they use their beaks in different ways to feed on different kinds of material. For example, there are some species with very large beaks that appear to be suitable for crushing large, hard seeds. Other species have smaller beaks that are more suitable for handling smaller seeds. In fact, some species will have slender gracile beaks that are more suited for picking insects off plants. And indeed, the size and shape of the different beaks of this group of Darwin's finches did correspond to what Darwin observed about their feeding ecology. Now, Darwin wondered, how is it possible that you would have species on different islands that were similar and yet so clearly different, and that the differences related so clearly to the environments in which those species lived? This pattern made perfect sense to Darwin if the various species were all descended from the same common ancestor, presumably an ancestor that had come from the mainland species that appeared similar to these island species. And if all of the island species had gradually evolved and diversified in a way that matched the habitats in which they lived. Darwin called this pattern descent with modification. And what we mean today by descent with modification is the idea that a group of species will have radiated from some single common ancestor, sharing similarities in common with each other and with that ancestor reflecting that common descent. Okay, Darwin spent 5 years going around the world collecting animals and plants and making observations like this. He returned from his trip in 1836, loaded with specimens and notebooks of his observations. And he spent more than 20 years actually working on what he called the species problem. During the time that he was working on this problem, he spent most of his time in his country estate in England. He was no longer going to travel. In fact, Darwin became quite ill, and it's thought that he might have developed a disease that he picked up on his ocean voyage. Chagas's disease has been mentioned. But he nonetheless continued to amass evidence by talking to naturalists who were collecting plants and animals from other parts of the world, and especially by looking at the effects of domestication on species. Evidence that convinced him that, not only convinced him that evolution occurs, but also suggested to him a particular mechanism by which evolution could occur. Darwin proposed this mechanism, the theory of natural selection, as early as 1844. He wrote a paper in 1844, 8 years after his return from the Beagle voyage, but he never published that paper. He was urged by friends and colleagues to publish it. Even his wife was urging him to publish it, although she knew that this theory might have a major impact on their lives because of the controversy that it could raise. But Darwin preferred instead to perfect his ideas. He didn't want to propose this idea until he had amassed so much evidence that the idea simply could not be refuted. And so he, in fact, spent another 10 or more years revising his ideas, revising his writing, collecting more specimens, evaluating more data. Darwin's hand was forced, however, in 1858 when he received a manuscript from Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a well-known naturalist, somebody who Darwin had been corresponding with, working in what is now Malaysia and Indonesia. Wallace's manuscript essentially presented the same idea of natural selection that Darwin had been working on for 20 years. And Wallace asked Darwin to submit this manuscript he sent for publication. I would imagine that Darwin was thunderstruck. He wrote to his friend Charles Lyell, who was now a close colleague. Remember, Lyell was the geologist. a close colleague and friend of Darwin's now, asking him for advice about what to do. Lyell arranged for Wallace's paper and for an excerpted synopsis of Darwin's 1844 manuscript, which Lyell had seen long ago, to be published simultaneously, giving credit for the discovery of the theory of natural selection to both men. Darwin then quickly finished the book-length version of his ideas that he had been working on for years, which was published the following year in 1859 with the title On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. Now, the essential observations behind the theory of natural selection are very straightforward. So let's review them now. Darwin was struck by three things. First, he was struck by how much variation he observed among individuals of the same species. Of course, individuals of a species all look alike, but no two were exactly alike. Darwin also recognized that some of this individual variation is passed on from parents to offspring. That is, Darwin observed that traits are heritable. Darwin didn't know the mechanism responsible for this. Remember, that's the kind of problem that Mendel had as well. But he argued that a mechanism must exist. Darwin's next important observation was that most species produce more offspring than ever survive. Now, in this, Darwin was influenced by the writings of Thomas Malthus, who was an economist who, around the turn of the 19th century, wrote an essay arguing that much of human suffering, including famine and homelessness, disease, and so forth, was inevitable as the result of the fact that the human population would always grow faster than the available resources needed to support it. In other words, Malthus argued that the size of the human population is limited by competition. And Darwin saw that this was true in animals and plants as well. Now, these observations led Darwin to the following conclusions. First, he concluded that given that more individuals are born in a population than can ever live, there must be competition for limited resources so that only some of those individuals are going to survive and eventually reproduce. Second, because individuals in a population differ in their characteristics, not all individuals are expected to be as successful in this competition. Particularly individuals with the most favorable variations, that is, individuals having traits that make them more successful in the prevailing environment in this competition, will be more likely to survive and more likely to reproduce. Therefore, these naturally selected individuals, as Darwin called them, will contribute more offspring to later generations. They will breed more. And finally, if the traits that contributed to the success of the parents are heritable, what we would say today is genetically heritable, then over time there will be more individuals possessing those traits than other traits, because the individuals with those traits have produced more offspring who inherit genetically the propensity to produce those same traits. We call traits that evolve this way adaptations, and so over time natural selection is thought to cause populations to change their characteristics in such a way that will increase adaptation to the prevailing environment. As I said, the first edition of Darwin's book was published in 1859, actually in November of that year, and all 1,000 copies that were originally printed were sold on the first day. People knew this idea was coming and they were eager to digest it. You can imagine the book created a major stir in Victorian England, as Darwin and some of his friends and wife had feared, largely because his theory was very quickly extended to humans, which was a very challenging thing. Darwin's idea also challenged the literal interpretation of the Bible and suggested that the hand of God, per se, was not necessary to account for all features of nature. In spite of this initial controversy, however, Darwin's work, which actually was not only The Origin, but many other books to follow, eventually held sway on one point, the fact that evolution occurred. And in fact, Darwin came to be considered one of the most famous and celebrated scientists of his day. For example, he was buried in Westminster Abbey in London and eulogized by the Archbishop of the Church of England when he died in 1882. By the end of the century, pretty much everyone accepted the idea that evolution occurs. Next time, we're going to take a look at a couple of examples of evolution in natural populations to explore this idea in a little more detail.